There's a bit questions also whether it was good for Afghanistan to have as many people come back home. I mean, we're talking over 5 million people that returned in a fairly small amount of time to a country that already was the bottom of most development index. Some people would argue, well, Afghanistan is poor, would have been poor anyway, so it didn't matter if we threw about 5 million people back into the country. Some other people would say, well, maybe it would have been better to do a far more, better controlled return and to provide more reintegration assistance, because there's an argument that most of the money was spent to get people into Afghanistan, basically give them some money, shake their hand and say you're on your own, and very little was done to make sure that there was adequate integration. While there have been settlement programs, particularly around land allocation schemes by UNHCR, the problematic issue is that the Afghan government only allows land allocation for returnees when they go back to where they originally came from. And it becomes very, very difficult then for the people who've now squattling into large urban areas. So you have seen a secondary displacement, particularly to large urban areas, particularly Kabul right now is probably estimated to consist of 70% of informal settlements. And also other cities like Jalalabad, Kandahar, but also Mazar-Herat have squatter settlements around them, which are considered to be actually secondary displaced returnees that were unable to go back to the area of origin, largely because of insecurity, of course, but also because of lack of livelihoods. There's been a breakdown over the years of war, and there's been very late investment in agriculture in a country where the majority of people actually would have been employed in the agriculture sector. And also, of course, a lot of refugees have been exposed to a semi-urban lifestyle while they were in the refugee camps, so they are less likely to go back to actually rural areas. So what restrains right now that many actually returnees feel a bit cheated, many feel they haven't really been, gotten what they were promised about return. One of course, is politics. I mean, for us, return had to be successful. For international actors, it had to be successful to prove that Afghanistan is on the right path. Second, insecurity is on the rise. I mean, basically, we could not even call Afghanistan post-conflict anymore, and I'm surprised people still do, because it actually is in conflict, even so the country is split and certain areas have more conflict than other areas. So it's the whole access. Then you have competing needs. As we say, Afghanistan is a poor country, so basically everybody's poor. And as many people have argued, how would you separate out a subpopulation, in an urban area when you have a large number of urban poor? And I think too little thinking has been done in integrated assistance programs to poor people in rural and urban areas, both displaced and undisplaced. So as I say, there's probably even a misunderstanding who are really the returnees. You have this kind of population called the Kuchi, which are the Afghan nomads who used to be nomadic. How do you make a nomad an internally displaced person, because they always used to move around? At what point, what makes them actually internally when they start settling on their migration path? So there's some definitional issues as well. There's this whole issue after 15 years in the area, are you still considered internally displaced or not, when you have de facto economically integrated but potentially not de jure integrated by having gotten the rights that you're actually able to live in the area, and that tomorrow and nobody could just bulldoze your area down. So, I mean, basically, I think we have not seen an end to the protectedness of the Afghan refugee population. Probably the ones that remain in Pakistan and Iran are unlikely to return, at least voluntarily, I have to say, because there could also be a certain level of coercion to probably entice them to go back. Research has shown that a lot of them are largely young, have been either born in exile or were very young when they went into exile. A lot of them have started identifying with their host countries more than with their return countries. For many, Afghanistan has become this strange place. Particularly for the ones in Pakistan, I tend to think that Afghanistan is this Sodom and Gomorrah, where you have basically unethical lifestyles and alcohol and bad influence of the internationals, particularly the Americans. So a lot of them are really probably would only go back if they were pushed to do so. I heard that yesterday UNHCR, with Pakistan, is starting to resume the voluntary return program. I really think that voluntary return will be highly unlikely unless people are really that already have gone to Afghanistan, are the ones that do go for work. We have people working in our organization whose family is still in Pakistan, they still go home. And particularly girls are kept in exile anyways until they have completed their education. So I think there needs to be, in terms of what we need to think at coming to the recommendations, there need to be a bit more thinking of what do you do with populations that have lived so long in exile that probably have a high unlikelihood to return. What do you do with them? And there have been some thoughts about more flexible labor agreements, where they're allowed to work. some of them have ID cards already. Some of them probably have both Afghan and Pakistan ID cards. There are ways for them to get it. It's probably much harder in Iran. So I think there's a lot more creative thinking needing what you do with a population that you cannot return home, that maybe for political or other reasons you don't want to have seen integrated in your society. And just to say, there really has never been a large concerted resettlement effort for Afghans because there's simply too many. And how do you then? I mean, it's always been very small numbers and very individualistic case levels. So I think there could be more research been done in that area to understand what could be done for the people that remain in exile. I think we need to have a much deeper research to understand the displacement that's going on right now in Afghanistan, the internal displacement, how long it should be, how long it is anticipated to be, will people go back? We need a bit more research to understand whether people will ever go back to the areas of origin, and if not, what are you going to do with them because of Afghanistan's way of integrating. So a lot more out-of-the-box thinking is also to look into assistance of host populations together with the displaced populations, because if you talk of a large proportion of urban poor, they share a lot of characteristics that are the same. So I think a lot more integrated return programs. Some people say that unless you've solved the political question between Afghanistan and Pakistan, you won't solve the refugee situation at all, period, because it's so highly politicized. Unless you solve some of the issues within Pakistan, you don't solve the problem in Afghanistan either. So some people say you can't even talk about the humanitarian assistance or displacement issue unless you've sorted some on the politics out of the games that Pakistan is playing, and why it is fueling the insurgency in Afghanistan. But if we do want to have return in the future, we do have to look at stability into Afghanistan. I know that's what right now being looked at by international actors. But if I can be frank, I think we're buying an exit strategy. We're not buying necessarily long-term stability in Afghanistan. There's some development which are rather troubling going on right now, which are being promoted by the U.S. military, particularly, which is Afghan local police, or basically militias. And there I think they should talk to the Soviet army a bit and understand what brought down a government after the Soviet army withdrew, because they had created pro-government militias already then. And a lot of people make the argument it's different now, but for most Afghans, it's a deja vu. And we recently had a workshop with women, and they actually fear these militias more than they fear the Taliban, which is kind of interesting because we arm them. So I think if we don't want to have the entire thing explode further in the future, I think a lot more thing needs to be thought about what we consider stability and what is a long-term political settlement versus a short-term stability for military purpose that allows the military to exit, which then won't have any guarantee that the things won't unravel after the military leaves. So there's a lot of things, in my opinion, that need to be addressed if we really want to see an end to the Afghan refugee crisis and not yet another beginning or yet another set of waves. And one of the biggest things where Afghanistan probably needs a system, which is probably very similar to Iraq, but also Sudan, is land. You've seen a high population growth. You've seen the problem of land grabbing. So there's a lot of people who can't even go back to land in certain areas, which is why it would be interesting maybe if you can't integrate, if you can't return, whether you may want to consider of resettlement of some of the more younger refugees that have remained in the host countries. And that's something that really hasn't been up for discussion. So I hope I haven't gone over.
No, thank you.